Hello everyone. So it's my honor to be here and thank you for your invitation. So the time is short, so let me go directly to the point. I will talk about 3 points. The first one is about how to understand China-US trade imbalance. And the second point is the economic impact of the China-US trade conflict to the Chinese economy and also to US and even to Korea as well. And finally, suppose I got time, I will talk about the strategy of China's further opening up. Indeed, my point is consistent with my colleague, Professor Tao Zigang from Hong Kong University. And for the first one, how to understand China-US trade imbalance, let's look at the diagram first. So we know that so far we got 2 stages for China-US trade conflict. The first one is that on June 15, President Trump imposed 25% tariff on the US dollar 50 billion goods imported from China. And as a retaliation, so Macron say, well, we will impose the same tariff rate on the identical amount of American imported goods. That's the first stage. And the second stage, you see that on September 24, so US imposed 10% on additional 200 billion, and then say, well, this tariff will raise to 25% in January 2019. And so China planned to retaliate on additional 60 billion and with the same tariff rate. And if we look at the data, you see that in the first stage, the consumption goods is only account for 1%. But when they go to 200 billion, these consumption goods account for 24%. And suppose we have a stage 3 trade war, then you will see that, the consumption good will be 40%. So, indeed, I agree with Professor Tao say, well, suppose we see period 2 or period 3. Maybe next year US have a bigger inflation rate in the next year. So let's see. Okay, that's the first one. And the first question is how to understand the Sino-US trade conflict. So President Trump talked about a lot on the trade issue, but in particular, I think that they can be summarized as these 4 sentences. So number 1 is say, well, trade surplus is good and trade deficit is bad. And usually he will use 2 examples. Number 1 is that if you look at the Sino-US trade deficit, last year is 270 billion US dollars. So that's a big number. And number 2 is say, well, because of China's export, lead to US loss maybe 3 million jobs in the last 10 years. So this is not a small number as well. And therefore, why is that? It's because the trade imbalance is because of China's export subsidy or it's because the unfair tariff rate. And usually he will mention 4 examples. Number 1, on the car tariff, so US is 2.5% and China is 25%. And the second one, I say, well, suppose you look at the IPR issue, and also suppose you look at the US investment to China is difficult, and something like this. So that's the second argument. And the next argument say, well, so what's the solution? The only solution for the trade imbalance for Trump administration say, well, then we only can have a high tariff on Chinese export. Okay. So, and the objective perhaps is say, well, maybe China should stay in the lower chain of the global supply chain and then the US stay in the high end of the global supply chain. And from China's perspective, it seems that neither one makes sense. So please allow me to interpret. So for the first one, let's look at the first one. Indeed, we say trade deficit is not necessarily bad. How can we say that? Because, well, let's think about one example. Suppose I export a T-shirt from China to US, but then with Chinese people get the money back. But the point is that you cannot put the dollar into the vault. You need to invest. But suppose you want to invest, you look around the world, the best way for you to invest is still buy the American bond, American security. So in other words, it's something like that. The US people borrow money from China. So we are financing the US economy's development. So you can see that, well, suppose from here, China's account for China's purchase of the security of the US account for China's current account, something like 35% on average. So that's number 1. Number 2, from China's perspective, trade surplus is not good as well. Because, well, suppose you got too much trade surplus, then definitely you will have an inflation pressure. So that is not what China like. So that's the first point. The second point is that suppose you look at the Sino-US trade deficit, I would like to say well, the trade deficit will always be there. It doesn't matter if in the Obama administration or the Trump or the post-Trump. It will be always there. Why is that? Because this is based on a competitive advantage, based on two countries' factor endowments. If we look at the trade structure, we can see that indeed there's two important industries. Number one is textile. Number two is machinery and transport equipment. So if you can see that from the table, you see that for textile, trade surplus is huge. And the reason is that because textile is labor-intensive industry. And by definition, which means that the labor cost is important component of the labor-intensive industry. And the labor cost of China now today is $700 per month for the blue-collar worker. And if you compare to the US, we will be $4,200. So it's about less than 20%. But if you compare to the total factor productivity between China and the US, you see that China's total factor productivity is about 45% of the US. Put simply, which means that suppose you produce one shoe in China, take 2 hours, but in US take 1 hour. But China's labor cost is only 20%. So even there's no government there, we still have a trade surplus, that's for sure. And then what happened for the machinery and transport equipment? We say, well, that's because of processing trade, as Professor Tao just said. So basically is that, well, China import raw material or key intermediate from Korea, from Japan, from US, and then we assembly and export to the US finally. So this processing trade indeed take the advantage of China's cheap labor once again. Okay. So you can see that, processing trade indeed is a huge amount and account for something like 36% to 50% of China's total trade. So put them together, what I want to say is, well, that is not because of the policy, but it's because of the economic structure that we have the trade surplus. But if you want to look at the trade, the trade policy, so number one, let's look at the tariff. We know that the tariff is determined by the WTO agreement. And we also know that, China is still a developing country. Because China's per capita GDP is less than $10,000 according to the World Bank classification. Therefore, well, China's tariff can be higher than the US. That's number one. Number two, but if you look at how high of China's tariff, it's not that high indeed. For example, in 2017, simple average tariff is 7.4%. But if you look at the import weighted tariff, it's 4.4%. It's pretty low. Certainly it's higher than, US 2.4%. But compared to Indonesia, compared to India, well, we are much, much lower. So that's number one. Number two, say, well, what happened for the others? For example, China certainly has export subsidy. But if you consider US, they also have export subsidy. Right, and they also have a high tariff from for example, let's consider a very famous example, Harley. So Harley, suppose without import tariff, Harley is already gone during the 1980s, the Japan and trade conflict. And certainly we also say, well, if you look at China's ODI always banned by Trump administration by the excuse of the national security. And then the point is, well, say national security. But the point is, well, even the firm is not SOE, is still banned. Let me give you one example. The semi-heavy industry. They want to acquire there was one firm in Oregon, but failed. Say, well, it's because of national security. And say, well, but the point is that, well, the company indeed is a private firm, not SOE instead. Okay. Anyway, so how to solve the problem? I think that, well, the good way is come back to the Obama administration. Obama also tried to reduce trade deficit, and China want to reduce the trade deficit as well. So fundamentally, there's no conflict between China and the US. The only conflict is that how to achieve that. Well, so now, Trump administration say we need to impose the high tariff. China say, well, how about this way? We keep our high export, but you also export more to US, to China. So in this case, we are able to make the cake bigger and bigger. Although we always got the identical slice, but then, well, everyone is happy. So this is what we call game from trade. Okay. And then, well, this one, let me skip about that because of time restriction. But let's talk about impact. So last year when President Trump got his position, we suspect there was a trade war coming. Therefore, we wrote this paper, and then after 1 year review published in the MIT policy journal, AEP there. So basically, we say we give a a name called The Day After Tomorrow because of the movie. So you see, so basically the point is that, well, suppose the Trump administration triggered the trade war, China has three possibilities to respond. Number one is do nothing, do not retaliate. Number two is retaliate with identical tariff rate. And option three is retaliate with identical rate, but then reduce trade surplus with other partners, which means import more from other countries. So, I mean, the paper is here from here, and then I put it onto my Chinese book. If you are interested, you can also read this book as well. So the basic point is that, well, let's look at the result. The first one is because now China has already retaliated, so the first option is gone. Now let's go to the second option. China retaliate with the identical rate. So what will happen? You see that we got 20 industries around, and all these industries, it seems that the bilateral trade between the two countries reduced a lot. For example, the oil almost reduced to 100%. And if you look at the other industry, we also have similar findings. For example, textile reduced a lot. And if China retaliate on the base metal, it also reduced a lot. Okay, so that's the first observation. But the key point is that what happened to the real GDP, also the real wage? We consider 62 countries, including OECD countries, all OECD countries, and 27 non-OECD countries, including ASEAN 10 countries. And the main findings is here. Idea is say, well, suppose US triggered war and China retaliate, but there's no other events, no other policy event. So in this case, what will happen? You will see that, well, for these 62 countries, some small country gains, like Singapore. And the reason is because, I mean, China cannot export directly to the US. We will export to Singapore first, and then from Singapore to US directly. That's number one. So why this small country gain? Can Hong Kong gain as well? I'm sorry, no. Because Hong Kong, according to the Ministry of the US, this also belongs to China, I mean, in terms of trade. Yeah, certainly, I mean, this is one part of China, but I'm talking about economics. So what I want to say is, so Hong Kong is number 60, and two countries got lost. And USA 61 and China 62. And the reason is because, well, there's no country can gain from trade. So it is obvious from here. So, but the point is that, okay, so Korea, you can see that. In this case, Korea, we are ranking number 55 and pretty bad here. Okay. And the second part is, what if US triggers, but then China retaliate, but further open up, which import more from other countries, including Korea, Japan, and the EU countries. In this case, we recalculate and simulate. So we see that, well, from this table, almost identical to the one that you saw before. But the finding on the real GDP are different. For example, if you look at the findings here, they're pretty different. Okay. Number one, you will see that, well, US still lost. And the reason for two reasons. Number one, for example, suppose when China export the t-shirt to the US is $10, and then Vietnam $12, and then US produced by itself $13. If US impose 25%, so this t-shirt will be 12.5. Certainly, it will not import from China. It will import from Vietnam. So I mean, China cannot export. But on the other hand, US still cannot take this job back. That's number one. Number two is that, well, in this case, US consumer had to pay higher wage, higher price on the product. That's number one. Number two is that, well, I mean, because China retaliate, so I mean, US, the American agriculture product cannot export to China. So that's another cost. So put them together, US, we got lost. But on the other hand, by the same token, China also faced this possible threat. But if China is able to import more from EU and Korea and Japan, then in this case, China's inflation, domestic inflation, will not increase that much. So China might be able to good. I mean, during this is a trade conflict. And with Korea, I checked the number, is about 14, not 55, but about 14. So indeed, I mean, this is what China government trying to do that. Well, suppose we had to have a trade conflict against US, then the other way is that China will open up with other countries. So, and for the strategy, I totally agree with Professor Tao, and I suppose I have a time where during the panel we can discuss. So, okay, so we still have a time. So it seems that I'm too fast. Okay, so here you can see that, well, how much is the trade cost to the US will be 0.7% to its GDP. So if US is 20 trillion US dollars, so times this 0.7% will be something like, well, 700 billion, something like this. So, I mean, this is not a small number, but certainly the point is whether China will lose from the trade conflict really depending on whether China will open up or not. So if we talk about the strategy, number one, we will increase import from other OECD countries. So in the last week, we saw, I mean, the Chinese import is positioned in Shanghai, right? So, I mean, that's an important event. And the second one is to allow market access on service industry, also further reduce tariff. Because the key point here is that, well, China now is a developing country, but after 2 years or 3 more years, China will move to the high-income country. Therefore, this tariff will be high, because now it's still 7%, and then we try to reduce to 4%, something like that, after 3 years. So in this case, then China need to reduce tariff. Even there's a no China-US trade conflict, China still will reduce its tariff and import more. Why is that? Because if you look at the statement 2 years ago from the MAPCOM, they say China will increase the import per year 2 trillion US dollars. And this is once again announced by President Xi in 1 week ago. China will import 30 trillion US dollar. Import 30 trillion US dollars within the next 15 years, which means that 1 year is 2 trillion US dollars. And number two, we will engage more in our FDI. So go to Africa, because now the China's labor cost is increasing. So far, China is still able to export product to the US. It's not because of China's labor cost still low, but it's because, well, compared to the other countries like Vietnam and Cambodia, our market size is large. And therefore, even our labor cost is higher than Vietnam and Cambodia. We are still able to export the product to US. But once again, if those countries, they get a larger and larger market, the export share from China will reduce a lot. That's why China need to export to other countries as well. Yeah. And the final one is that China will insist on multilateral cooperation, which means the WTO and also the regional trade agreement, which means that so China now intensely working on the CHK, right? So I mean, yeah, so I mean CJK, right? CJK trade agreement and the other stuff. If we got time, we will introduce later. Okay, so yeah, so that's all. Thank you so much.